Good afternoon. I'd like to add my thanks to the many thanks that have been given so far to the organizers of Fast Forward. I've enjoyed every moment so far, and I'm very, very privileged to be here amongst you today. My topic is an unusual one because I'm a migrant to Australia from Canada. I've lived there half my life. I'm an Australian citizen, and I've worked very closely with Aboriginal photographers since I ended up in Queensland. One of my PhD students was the first Aboriginal photographer to receive a PhD at my university, and it was her encouragement to put in for this paper for the conference. So I hope you enjoy what I've got to say. We're looking here at an image of Tracy Moffat, who is probably pretty well known on the international scene. She has been a terrific influence for emerging photographers in Queensland and in Australia, probably internationally. And I noticed that one of the pieces that I'm going to be working with today is actually one that is in the Tate collection, so maybe you'll be able to see it. I've organized my talk around an idea that started many years ago about how photographic methods relate to photographic themes. And in the Aboriginal community, where the multivariate voice has been very late in coming, that the methods can probably be seen on a continuum of practice between those that are political and confrontational, that are reacting very angrily and very strongly against the lack of voice in the Aboriginal community in colonial times, through to work that is very playful, very light, very humorous, and of course that's in the Australian vernacular. They have a lot of fun. In the middle, there is a group of artists that I'm going to look at that I would call reconciliatory or diplomatic. And this idea came about in discussions with Leah King-Smith, who was the PhD student that I've just mentioned. Here we see Tracy Moffat in her self-portrait that hung 5 meters high at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney when she had a retrospective there several years ago. And no one, not one person who reviewed the show and who saw this image, even in the National Library of Canberra, where this image is on prominent display, has mentioned that the reflection in her sunglasses is actually the Aboriginal flag. It's the fist in the air of the Aboriginal people of Australia. And for some reason, I've always found that highly amusing. So I've entitled my project today, The Last Laugh, and I'm thinking that there are many things in the Aboriginal vernacular that I'm hoping will become the last laugh. I'm starting with the idea of an alternative aesthetics. I think that Aboriginal people both use photography in a way that is very common, but they also subvert some of those meanings. I also think that they use different methods that really get at an Aboriginal perspective, one of those perspectives being the narrative in the oral tradition of Aboriginal people that has been disrupted by the colonial gaze. And they're trying to put back those voices and those discourses and stories. So they're using inventive methods. The other thing that they use is what I call a nonlinear narrative space, in nonlinear sense of time, which is very opposite to what you might think of the photographic moment. And I'm thinking about one of our presenters yesterday who was talking about Rydat's photographs in Poland, who was very much a champion of the preservation of the moment, the preservation and of the photograph, whereas in the Aboriginal community, especially in the Yolngu community of northern Queensland, they actually think of the photograph as incidental to the narrative. It has no meaning and no place. All of the traditions are handed down in an oral tradition. However, those traditions have been severed, families have been removed from their homes, and the stolen generation of children that were taken to mission schools that had to either find their families again or were never reunited, ended up in an urban and more Western kind of civilization. It's easy to see why those Aboriginal photographers pay very little attention to this notion of photography actually documenting time in a significant way. I'm going to talk about Fiona Foley first. Fiona is a very powerful voice and very confrontational and dramatic with her work. She has taken, in this particular set that she's done, The Oyster Fisherman, she takes unknown history of Queensland and she sets about, as she says, educating people about their own history. And of course, not just the history of Aboriginal people, but white Australia as well. In Oyster Fisherman, she relies on a documentary genre style to establish a sense of truth in fiction, which is an indicator of nonlinear time that creates an Indigenous standpoint of history. The narrative is considered and research-driven. She does a lot of research. She explains she takes a long time to think and filter information, sometimes up to 2 years. But the outcome is highly speculative. It's based on fact, but it is not factual. Now, most Queenslanders do not know that in the 1880s, the pearling industry was one of the two main fishing industries in Queensland, nor that brutal kidnapping of slaves was carried out. Viewers would not likely argue with the representation in these photographs. No one knows enough to disagree. The sepia toning here registers the historicity of the image, while the blue dress is a replica of the mission clothing of that time. In installation, the dress and whip are presented alongside the photographs as objects. Fiona Foley's photographic methods are directorial, usually with herself as protagonist. In an anecdote to the reenactment of this series, Fiona remarked that the effect of the shoot on the participants, who were not professional actors, was profound. Indeed, the use of non-professionals runs throughout the works of the photographers that I'm going to show you today. Tracy Moffat is so well known in Australia and internationally that I will only be touching on some of the things briefly. There's a lot of critical information that's been written about Tracy, and she probably has the bulk of critical reviews of Aboriginal photography in Australia. This paper, I'm hoping, will add a little bit to the pile. But there is a dearth of critical review. When there is a show of Aboriginal photography, very often it gets overlooked in the papers and in the reviews. She's generated the bulk of critical writing on Indigenous photography, but not all of it has been positive. There's been a lot of criticism of her methods and also of the quality of her work, and of course, this is a subtle form of racism. I believe the challenge of her so-called intellectual contempt for critical reviews is strategic. In other words, she doesn't say very much because really she'd be extra criticized if she did. So the strategy is to let other people have their say and her to concentrate on her work. It's echoed in other Indigenous photographers as well, such as Destiny Deacon, and it belies the intensity of the work and of the work's methods. Tracy herself said, "I'm actually very Aboriginal in that I hate answering serious, direct, already thought through questions. I find direct questions so intrusive." In Mother's Day here, from a Scarred for Life series, the first series, she uses an illustrated magazine format. She says it was inspired by looking at 60s American Life magazine layouts. And it's a play on documentary practice. Each image is set with text in dated offset color, reminiscent of the date that coincides with the event. There is also two dates here, the date that the event occurred, the date that the image was actually exhibited. Even in these small details, you get a sense of the Aboriginal nonlinear narrative time, that time is malleable and photographs and narratives are permeable, so that the present is also the future and the past is also the present. So this circular idea that everything is influential at all times, it's very much like the already, always present notions of global feminisms. There's an already, always present kind of sense of Aboriginality. And the old people, the elders, and what happened to you when you were young follows through from generation to generation in the tradition of the oral storytelling. So it may not be a Dreamtime story. In this case, it's a story that is very personal. This is one of the few images that Tracy has admitted actually happened to her. Mostly they were just stories and things she gathered from friends and other family members. But it is an indication of the generational effects of abuse and the present currency of social issues in the Aboriginal community. Although carefully staged, the blurred focus of the force of movement here is confronting for the intimacy with which they tell the stories of those people whose bodies they represent. The Up in the Sky series is one that the Tate Modern has in its collection, and I do hope that you get to see it. It's a brilliant set of works that were delivered to the public in Australia in 1997, which was the same year that the so-called report on the stolen generation in Australia, which actually was called Bringing Them Home, but everybody refers to both the events and its report as the stolen generation. This is a directorial series, and you see it all here. I'm sorry it's a little bit small, but I wanted you to get the idea of how you can read these in an order. They are numbered, but the story is kind of circular. As a whole, the indeterminate narrative, the role reversals of race and gender, the eclectic mix of rural individuals, social isolation, and vast outback settings of landscape all contribute to a convincing reflection on the human condition, as well as a commentary on the Australian collective memory. Individual images contain details that indicate the narrative, but the way that they are displayed and installed varies from gallery to gallery, and I've seen a number of different installations of this work. This one is just one of the most interesting ones because the curator has put it not in a block or a grid or a line as we might think of a story, but as a kind of a curious grouping of photographs and according to the characters that are inside each of the photographic works. These people that we see here are an array of neighbours and townsfolk drawn from their beds, staring in witness directly at the lens, implicate the viewer as a protagonist. It is us, we, the people looking at the photograph, that is being gawped at, censured, or pitied. The cinematic effect is reinforced by the slightly fuzzy quality of the printing, which divests the motifs of the precise definition that in photography conventionally stress its indexality, specificity, and actuality. And this is one of the methods that gets at the slightly surreal or not quite linear narrative of this set of photographs. This image here has two other iterations in the series, if you caught them earlier. One is the initial establishing of the story, and an almost identical twin image showing a slightly different view of another hole punctured in the wall nearer to the infant's feet. The highly charged oppositional extremes of a peacefully sleeping baby against the backdrop of implied violence, part of a window that we saw through earlier, with an implied fate in the presence of the nuns that we eventually see the baby in the arms of. The window is reminiscent of what lies beyond, either hope or fear, the peaceful sleep of death, the angelic innocence of cherubs, and of course, a harbinger sent to warn us. The narratives are laced with interracial relationships and oppositional genders. I don't know if you noticed earlier, but there are 3 very muscular women with their sledgehammers breaking up an abandoned car body in the outback desert. And this is, you see the bodies of cars just abandoned everywhere in the central part of Australia. And the idea that the people come in and make it their business to destroy and so forth. But they are very muscular women and not men. Here we see a mother, we assume is the mother, holding on to her half-caste child and being run out of town. Of course, it was usually the Aboriginal mother whose child was taken away if it had a light-colored skin. These are fluctuating characters and settings through different places in time. Time is a sense for an audience that it's nearly always the middle of the story that is being told. So here we are all involved in this multivariate discourse and its circular notions of time and place, and more importantly, its progression. Picturesque Cherbourg number 3 is a collaged photograph. In the collage photographs of the set, bright flowers, white picket fences put a brave face on a traumatic history. The town of Cherbourg started as a mission government settlement in the early 1900s. Aboriginal people were transported from all over Queensland and New South Wales after being forced from their land. The old people, says Tracy, didn't want to talk about it, like war veterans. The bright picture postcard's saturated color belies the dark history and the resident social trauma, which is continuing today. I've taken students out to Cherbourg to work with the Aboriginal students of the school there. In fact, we donated our old enlargers for their darkroom, and they did photographic books to help to raise the self-esteem of the young Aboriginal children in that area. But the torn collages here, we see no people. They're presented on a single surface in the final photograph, but they indicate fractures and slippages, omitting any trace of events and occupants, literally covering up what is happening behind the sunny images. And not very many people in Queensland ever get news from Cherbourg. Destiny Deacon, again, uses avatars, alternative aesthetics, for her social commentary, and much of her work is very confrontational. The range of dolls and images she uses are multiple, they're often ambiguous. Even this necessity of such numbers of works is problematical. She makes them by the dozens for every exhibition. The content demands an initial reading of protest, of injustices that are linked to racism. But there is a lot more going on to her work, with her work, than just that. A study of the range of works suggests sub-themes within a black world, such as domestic violence or neglect of toys, if not children. The images are deeply, sharply disturbing. Destiny Deacon is an expert in convert skirmishes and has adapted and developed a personal play and a way with doublespeak. She has her own language of expression and obfuscation, of simultaneous violence and gentleness. The use of dolls as avatars and the amateurish photographic quality of many of her images present a social as well as aesthetic affront, and which is articulated by Geraldine Barlow. I love this review because she actually had the courage to say what many people in the art world were thinking when they looked at Destiny's exhibitions. The out of focus, the crudely made, the haphazardly framed and kind of conceptual or notional gap in between. As much as I look, I cannot decide whether these moments of awkwardness are deliberate. In writing this, I'm intensely aware and uncomfortable about the implied values that govern my own reading of what might be proper, compelling, and aesthetically rewarding. Of course, in my theory. It is intentional, and that discomfort is one of the things that gets our attention. Ria is another Aboriginal artist whose work is quite complex in that she uses still photographs and video work in the same installation. The setting for this work, which is a part of an entire installation, is near Daylesford in Victoria, where the renowned Heidelberg artist lived and worked in plein air. My underlying research, says Ria, has been into the Heidelberg painters. They simply didn't see the presence of Aboriginal people in the country. The Indigenous people were invisible to them. There are many stories woven into this complex work. In one video sequence, the woman, Ria, disappears, fading away, then reappears, then disappears again, suggesting an endless cycle. Again, this fits in with the notion of nonlinear time and generational change and similarity. In the Debble triptych here, we read the loss of identity as the visage fades digitally, and we see the body's gradual successive disappearance into the landscape. And this image, the final image in that series, is hopefully a little easier for you to see. However, the interpretations are numerous. There's a suggestion of the threat of the supernatural. And of course, the supernatural has been used as a platform for the display and exhibition of Aboriginal work since I've lived in the country. And it's always problematical because it's too easy to see the hauntedness of the past and the ghosts of the past and so forth. In actual fact, in Aboriginal nonlinear time, the spirits of the past are also present. So there's not the nostalgia for the past that we might think of in a Western setting. But also the Indigenous identity with the physical and conceptual landscape. As well, there is the idea of blotting out the rendering invisible of Indigenous cultures, and in particular, Indigenous women. My next set of works I've kind of called reconciliatory or diplomatic. And as I said, the notion of photographic methods in relationship to diplomatic images evolved over many discussions with Leah King-Smith, whose work you see here, who studied with me between 2001 and 2006. Her reasoning about diplomacy in photography is that a diplomatic avenue of approach disrupts the sovereignty of a singular perception by creating multiple views and pathways of communication. The reconciliatory aspect of patterns of connection, one of her early works, is one of the most misrepresented in Australian critical discourse, especially in view of the careful consultation and fraught process of permissions that Leah undertook for the work. She was using a system in art school where she scraped off the silver off the back of mirrors, and she used two images simultaneously to get her result. The images in the background are of the archival image, back to front, and of course that's because of the mirror, and the mirror itself is part of the idea of the diplomacy. It's like you read things, they're not sort of set as factual numbers. So she's using multiple images and a layering system to give people a choice of where they're going to go. In dresses, she uses a detail from a colonial dress in order to abstract the notion that we're not looking at individuals, but we're looking at the effects of colonization. We also see her hand-painted landscape that she's colored over as a pattern for the dress, but also hidden in there is this idea of the land or going back to country, which is what they call Aboriginal spirits that go that are being repatriated to their tribal lands. And here we see hands with the same thing. She's got buttons and hats and things. Her last work here is a work for the Commonwealth Games of all the Aboriginal athletes. This is Kyle Vanderkoop, who was adopted as part of the stolen generation by a Dutch family. There's many Aboriginal children that have been repatriated to Australia from Europe. Kyle's family actually live in Australia. And we see here the time in the present with the manhole, with his watch. We see time and country in the slight reflection of the veins and the twigs in the background. Genevieve Greaves has done a series of 12 or to 15 what we call moving photographs. You don't see it here the way you would in the gallery. It actually is a single small digital work that then is still for much of its presence, and then it moves as the photographer comes in and clothes the people and gets them to move around and so forth. In one of the images here, we see the way it was taken, which was in her lounge room with some of her friends and an itinerant German photographer. She thought great German. There was a lot of German photographers in the colonial era, very good ones that I've studied. And of course, she said even doing the shoot, there was a lot of tension. And finally, she said to the photographer, maybe you better get them to do a jig. And here, of course, we see him playing around in the background. She also included this image called Family because of the 15,000 images that she looked at. She actually found that at the end of the 1910s and 20s, many families were actually using the photographic opportunity to get images the way that they wanted. I've got a few other emerging artists here. I'll just go through them very quickly. Diane Jones puts her family back into the picture of the colony. Her father and her cousin were gun shearers. That means you have to prove that you can shear 200 sheep in a day. And of course, Shearing the Rams is a very well-known painting by Tom Roberts from the 1800s. Celeste Gibson found out about her Indigenous background. Her family had repressed all of the information in the family archive, and she uses glitchy applications of scanners and things. And in fact, in some of the photographs that she found from her family and from the interviews she did, she used some of the material from the interview to actually hack the image, which then changes and repeats and warps some of the things. And as she says, it very much mirrored the way that she felt about discovering this part of her background. Finally, we have The Last Laugh. In every one of the series that we've looked at, there are always people laughing and there's always hidden smiles. I mean, these are collaborative works, and the people are very much aware of Tracy's using them as the protagonists in a story that really has no history but all history. And so you see here in the background a lad with his head thrown back in laughter as we rush with the photographer to the fight scene. We see people who have got moments of, social embarrassment that play out in small towns. We see first jobs, people who, use the job as a bit of independence to make their way out into the wider world. So very, very much, that's Tracy in there, in the Pineapple Factory. And Fiona Foley, whose work is usually very hard-hitting, here fooling around with a bunch of Florida Seminole Indians. The review in Australia was that they were tired of Fiona always standing there with her bachelor people looking out over the Aboriginal landscape. And of course, the joke was on the reviewer. The review was taken away from the website within 24 hours when they discovered their mistake. Destiny Deacon, The Last Laugh. Here she is with her girlfriends and a black doll with the Aboriginal flag on it as a T-shirt. In Queensland, there's an expression, you gotta laugh, mate. I learned that when I first moved there. And I found out that the end of that expression is, or you would cry. Destiny says herself she likes to think that there's a laugh and a tear in every image. And I would like to think that instead of the last laughs, or laughing for the last time, that actually it will be that she who laughs last laughs best. Thank you.